when the elderly woman walking barefoot along Interstate 95 turned to face me with those haunting blue eyes and whispered the words that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my past, I realized that some stories never truly end. They just wait 53 years for the right moment to reveal their final chapter. If you believe that love can transcend time and that some connections are too powerful to be broken by decades of separation, you're going to want to hear every word of what happened on that scorching July afternoon when my routine Miami to Jacksonville route became a journey into the deepest chambers of my own heart. My name is Robert Mitchell, and I've been driving charter buses for Collins Transportation for 27 years, ever since I retired from my job as a high school principal and needed something to keep me busy during what my late wife Helen used to call my restless retirement years. At 71 years old, I thought I'd seen everything the highways of Florida could throw at me, from hurricane evacuations to spring break chaos to the endless parade of snowbirds migrating between their summer and winter lives. But nothing in nearly 3 decades of professional driving had prepared me for the sight that greeted me at mile marker 318, just north of Port Orange, where an elegant woman in her late 60s was walking slowly along the shoulder of one of America's busiest interstate highways, her silver hair catching the afternoon sunlight like a beacon of distress. She was wearing what appeared to be a vintage wedding dress, yellowed with age and torn in several places, the kind of gown that might have been beautiful 50 years ago, but now looked like a costume from a different era entirely. Her feet were bare and bleeding from walking on hot asphalt, and she moved with the deliberate, measured pace of someone who had been walking for hours without any clear destination in mind. The 28 passengers I was transporting from a church conference in Miami to various stops along the eastern seaboard looked up from their conversations and reading as I began to slow the bus, probably expecting another routine rest stop or mechanical issue. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced over the intercom, trying to keep my voice steady despite the growing concern I felt as I watched this solitary figure through my windshield, "we're going to make an unscheduled stop to check on someone who appears to be in distress. I'll need just a few minutes to ensure this person is safe and doesn't need medical attention." The response from my passengers was immediate and supportive, with several voices calling out offers to help and expressions of concern for whoever had prompted this unexpected detour from our planned route. I activated my emergency flashers and carefully maneuvered the large coach onto the shoulder, positioning it between the walking woman and the traffic that continued to rush past at 75 miles per hour. As I stepped down from the driver's seat and walked toward her through the oppressive Florida heat, I noticed details that made her situation even more puzzling and concerning. The wedding dress, despite its age and current condition, was clearly expensive, made from silk and lace with intricate beadwork that suggested it had been created by skilled hands for a very special occasion. Her posture was dignified despite her obvious distress, and she carried herself with the kind of refined bearing that spoke of education, social status, and a lifetime of maintaining appearances even in the most difficult circumstances. "Ma'am," I called out as I approached, raising my voice to be heard over the constant roar of traffic. "Are you all right? Do you need assistance?" She stopped walking but didn't immediately turn around, standing perfectly still as if my voice had triggered some internal struggle between acknowledging my presence and continuing whatever solitary journey had brought her to this dangerous and unlikely location. When she finally did turn to face me, the impact of her direct gaze hit me like a physical force, because those eyes were achingly familiar in a way that made my chest tighten with recognition I couldn't quite place. "I'm fine, thank you," she said in a voice that carried the refined accent of someone who had spent their life in social circles where proper diction was valued above authenticity. "I'm just trying to get home, though I'm not entirely certain where home is anymore." Her words were spoken with the kind of measured politeness that Southern women of a certain generation used to deflect concern while maintaining their dignity, but I could hear the tremor underneath that suggested she was anything but fine. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you're walking along one of the most dangerous highways in Florida in temperatures that are approaching 95 degrees, and you're not wearing shoes," I said gently, trying to strike the right balance between showing concern and respecting her obvious desire to handle whatever crisis had brought her to this point with as much privacy as possible. "I'm Robert Mitchell, and I'm the driver of that charter bus behind us. I've got air conditioning, cold water, and a bus full of people who would be happy to help you figure out how to get wherever you need to go safely." She studied my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable, as if she was searching for something specific in my features, some confirmation of a suspicion that was either being validated or disappointed by what she saw. "Robert Mitchell," she repeated slowly, testing the sound of my name with the careful attention someone might give to a piece of music they thought they recognized but couldn't quite place. "You said your name is Robert Mitchell?" "Yes, ma'am. That's right. And I'm wondering if you could tell me your name so I can help you contact someone who might be worried about you, or arrange transportation to wherever you need to go." I was beginning to worry not just about her physical safety, but about her mental state, because there was something in her expression that suggested she was seeing more than just a concerned bus driver offering assistance to a stranded traveler. She was quiet for a long moment, continuing to stare at my face with that unsettling intensity, and I could see tears beginning to form in her eyes as some internal recognition seemed to solidify into certainty. "My name is Margaret Rose Pemberton," she said finally, her voice becoming stronger and more emotional with each word. "But 53 years ago, my name was supposed to become Margaret Rose Mitchell, and you, Robert Mitchell, left me standing at the altar of First Presbyterian Church of St. Augustine on June 12, 1971, in front of 350 guests who had come to witness our wedding." The world seemed to stop moving around us as her words registered in my consciousness, bringing back memories I had spent decades trying to forget, faces and feelings and heartbreak that I had buried so deeply I sometimes convinced myself they had happened to someone else entirely. Margaret Rose Pemberton had been Margaret Rose Stewart when I knew her, the most beautiful girl in our graduating class at St. Augustine High School, the daughter of a prominent banker who had made it clear that a poor kid from the wrong side of town was never going to be good enough for his precious daughter, no matter how much we loved each other or how many plans we made for our future together. Standing on that scorching highway shoulder 53 years after the worst day of both our lives, I felt 17 years old again, remembering with painful clarity the morning I woke up in my tiny apartment above Morrison's hardware store with a letter that had been slipped under my door during the night. The letter that changed everything, the letter that convinced me that leaving Margaret Rose at the altar was the kindest thing I could do for her, even though it would destroy both of us in the process. Her father, Charles Stewart, had written in his precise banker's handwriting that he had evidence of my family's criminal connections, documentation that would send my father to prison and destroy what little reputation the Mitchell name had left in our small town, unless I disappeared from Margaret Rose's life immediately and permanently. "Margaret Rose," I whispered, and saying her name out loud after all these years felt like opening a wound that had never properly healed, despite decades of trying to convince myself that I had moved on, built a good life, found happiness with Helen and our 3 children, who never knew that their father had once loved someone so completely that walking away from her had nearly killed him. "I looked for you everywhere after that day. I tried to explain, tried to find you, tried to make you understand why I couldn't go through with the wedding." She laughed, but it was the bitter sound of someone who had spent 53 years rehearsing this conversation, polishing her hurt and anger, until they had become as much a part of her identity as her own name. "You looked for me. Robert, I waited for you at that church for 3 hours. 3 hours in my grandmother's wedding dress, while our guests whispered and speculated, and gradually began to leave because it became obvious that the groom had simply changed his mind about marrying into the Stewart family. My father spent the entire time telling everyone that he had always known you weren't reliable, that boys from your background couldn't be trusted with responsibilities as important as marriage and family." The traffic continued to rush past us at deadly speeds, but I was completely absorbed in this impossible reunion, this chance to finally explain decisions that had haunted me for more than 5 decades, to tell her about the letter that had forced me to choose between destroying her father financially and socially, or breaking both our hearts by walking away from the only woman I had ever truly loved, with the desperate, consuming intensity that only happens once in a lifetime. "Margaret Rose, your father threatened to have my father arrested for embezzlement if I went through with the wedding," I said, my voice breaking, as I revealed the secret I had carried alone for 53 years, because protecting her family's reputation had seemed more important than protecting my own heart. "He said he had evidence that my father had been stealing from Stewart First National Bank, where he worked as a janitor, and that he would send him to prison unless I left town immediately without contacting you or explaining why I was going. Her expression shifted from anger to confusion to something that might have been understanding as she processed information that clearly contradicted everything she had believed about our broken engagement and my sudden disappearance from St. Augustine. My father said you had taken money from him, that he had discovered you were planning to use our marriage as a way to gain access to the Stewart family finances, that everything about our relationship had been calculated to take advantage of my naivety and his generosity. The lies that Charles Stewart had constructed to separate us were even more elaborate and cruel than I had realized, designed not just to drive me away, but to poison Margaret Rose's memories of our relationship, to convince her that the love we had shared was false, manipulative, and unworthy of her grief. I never took a penny from your family, Margaret Rose. I worked 2 jobs throughout high school to save money for our wedding and our life together. I loved you more than I had words to express, and leaving you was the hardest thing I ever did, but I believed it was the only way to protect you from the scandal your father threatened to create. Behind us, I could hear stirring from the charter bus as my passengers began to realize that this roadside stop was taking much longer than expected and involved more complicated circumstances than a simple mechanical check or routine assistance to a stranded motorist. Several of them had gotten off the bus despite the oppressive heat, standing in whatever shade they could find, while respectfully maintaining enough distance to give Margaret Rose and me privacy for what was obviously an intensely personal conversation. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, a 78-year-old retired teacher from the Miami church group who had appointed herself the unofficial spokesperson for the passengers during our trip, approached us with the confident stride of someone accustomed to taking charge of situations that required adult supervision and common sense. "Robert, dear, this lady needs to get out of this heat immediately. And so do you. Why don't we all continue this conversation on the bus, where everyone can sit down in the air conditioning with cold drinks while you sort out whatever needs to be sorted out?" Margaret Rose looked at me with an expression that combined hope, fear, and 53 years of accumulated hurt, as if she was trying to decide whether accepting help from strangers on a charter bus would be admitting defeat or opening the door to possibilities she had given up on decades ago. "I don't want to inconvenience your passengers, Robert. I don't even know how I ended up walking on this highway, or exactly where I was trying to go when you found me. I need to pause here, because I can see some of you have been with me through this entire impossible reunion, and if you're still listening, it means you understand something profound about love, loss, and the mysterious ways that life can circle back on itself when we least expect it. This isn't just entertainment for you, is it? You recognize something in Margaret Rose and me. Something about the connections that shape us, the regrets we carry, the what-ifs that haunt our quiet moments when we're honest about the roads we didn't take, and the people we've never stopped loving despite the passage of time. If you're someone who believes that real love stories don't always have happy endings, but deserve to be told anyway, if you've ever wondered about the person who got away or the choice you wish you could make over again, I want you to know that you've found your community here. This channel isn't about fairy tales or perfect relationships that never face real challenges. It's about the messy, complicated, heartbreaking reality of loving someone across decades and distances and circumstances that seem designed to keep you apart. I'd love for you to join our family by subscribing, not because I want to boost numbers or hit metrics, but because stories like this need witnesses, people who understand that hope and healing can happen at any age, in any circumstance, when we have the courage to stay open to possibilities we thought we had lost forever. Leave a comment and tell me about your own Margaret Rose, the person you never stopped loving, the relationship that shaped you even though it didn't last, the moment when someone from your past reappeared and changed everything you thought you knew about your own story. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that it's never too late for second chances. Never too late for truth to replace the lies we've believed about ourselves and each other. Never too late for love to find a way, despite everything that seems determined to keep it buried in the past. "Margaret Rose," I said gently, taking her hand in mine for the first time in 53 years and feeling the electric recognition that some connections transcend time, distance, and all the ways we try to convince ourselves we've moved on. "You're not inconveniencing anyone. These are good people who understand that sometimes the most important conversations happen in the most unexpected places, and right now, the most important thing is making sure you're safe while we figure out together what happens next." As we walked toward the charter bus together, her hand still in mine, I couldn't help but notice that despite everything she had endured, despite the wedding dress that suggested she was struggling with dementia or some other condition that had caused her to lose track of time and place, Margaret Rose Stewart Pemberton still moved with the grace and dignity that had made me fall in love with her when we were teenagers who thought forever was possible, and that love could conquer any obstacle that families or circumstances or cruel fate might place in our path. The air conditioning on the charter bus provided immediate relief from the oppressive Florida heat, and my passengers responded to Margaret Rose with the kind of instant kindness that reminds you most people are fundamentally good when faced with someone who clearly needs help and compassion. Mrs. Blackwood immediately offered her seat near the front of the bus, while Reverend Thomas Matthews from Jacksonville began digging through his travel bag for bottled water and the emergency snacks his wife always packed for long trips. Within minutes, Margaret Rose was seated comfortably, sipping cold water and accepting the gentle ministrations of people who understood that sometimes loving your neighbor means taking care of strangers who cross your path in unexpected ways. "Now then, dear," Mrs. Blackwood said in her warm grandmotherly voice that had probably soothed thousands of students over her 40-year teaching career. "Robert tells us your name is Margaret Rose, and it's clear you two have some history together that needs sorting out. But first, we need to make sure you're physically all right and figure out where you belong so people aren't worrying about you." Her practical approach to crisis management was exactly what the situation needed, providing structure and immediate care while giving Margaret Rose and me space to process the emotional complexity of our unexpected reunion. Margaret Rose looked around the bus at the concerned faces of my passengers, these strangers who had accepted without question that their travel schedule was less important than helping someone in distress, and I could see her struggling with the vulnerability of needing assistance from people she didn't know, while simultaneously feeling grateful for their unconditional kindness. "I live at Sunset Manor Assisted Living in Palm Coast," she said quietly, "or at least I think I do. Sometimes I get confused about where I am or what year it is, especially when I'm upset about something or when memories feel more real than whatever is happening in the present moment." The revelation that Margaret Rose was struggling with some form of cognitive decline added another layer of heartbreak to our reunion, because it meant that this chance encounter on Interstate 95 might be our only opportunity to finally have the honest conversation that had been denied to us for 53 years. Whatever time we had together today might be all the time we would ever have to explain, to forgive, to find some kind of closure or peace with the choices that had shaped both our lives in ways neither of us had fully understood until this moment. Reverend Matthews, a gentleman in his early 60s who had been listening to our conversation with the skilled attention of someone accustomed to providing pastoral care in complicated situations, leaned forward in his seat with the kind of expression that suggested he had something important to contribute. "Margaret Rose, would you like me to contact Sunset Manor to let them know you're safe and that we're bringing you home? I imagine there are people there who are very worried about you right now, and they'll be relieved to know you're in good hands." "Yes, please," she replied, then looked at me with eyes that were simultaneously lucid and confused, present and lost in memories that seemed to shift between decades without warning. "But first, I need Robert to tell me the truth about what really happened on our wedding day, because I've spent 53 years believing that I wasn't worth fighting for, that our love wasn't strong enough to overcome whatever obstacles we faced, that I was foolish to think a boy like you could really want to spend his life with a girl like me." The pain in her voice was almost unbearable, because it revealed how deeply Charles Stewart's lies had wounded her, how completely they had poisoned her self-worth and her ability to trust her own judgment about love, relationships, and her value as a human being worthy of genuine affection and commitment. I realized that in trying to protect her from scandal, I had condemned her to a lifetime of believing she wasn't lovable enough to inspire the kind of devotion that would overcome external obstacles. "Margaret Rose, I need you to listen to me very carefully," I said, taking both her hands in mine while 28 strangers provided silent witness to what felt like the most important conversation of both our lives. "I loved you with everything I had. I would have married you that day and fought your father, and faced whatever consequences came from that fight if I had understood what the real stakes were. But I was 19 years old, scared, and convinced that walking away was the noble thing to do because it would spare you the humiliation of being married to someone your family would spend the rest of their lives trying to destroy. I told her about the letter that had been waiting for me on the morning of our wedding, about her father's threats to have my father arrested for embezzlement, about my desperate belief that loving someone meant protecting them, even if that protection required destroying your own heart in the process. I explained how I had tried to find her after leaving town, how I had written letters that were returned unopened, made phone calls that were never answered, visited St. Augustine years later, only to discover that the Stewart family had moved away without leaving any forwarding information. I married Helen Garrison in 1975, I continued, wanting her to understand the full scope of how our broken engagement had shaped both our lives, and she was a wonderful woman who gave me 3 beautiful children and 43 years of partnership and companionship. But she knew, and I knew, that there was a part of my heart that would always belong to you, that would always wonder what our life together might have been like if I had been brave enough to fight for us instead of noble enough to walk away. Margaret Rose was crying now, not the bitter tears of someone who had spent decades nursing hurt and resentment, but the cleansing tears of someone who was finally receiving answers to questions that had haunted her entire adult life. I never married Robert. I came close several times, had relationships with good men who would have taken care of me and given me the stable, comfortable life my parents wanted for me, but I could never commit completely to anyone else, because I was always comparing them to you, always measuring their love against the intensity of what we had shared, always wondering if I was settling for less than what I had lost. The tragedy of 2 lives shaped by lies, misconceptions, and the inability to communicate across barriers created by pride, fear, and family interference was almost overwhelming to contemplate. We had both paid enormous emotional prices for decisions made by other people, for Charles Stewart's determination to control his daughter's life, and my teenage conviction that sacrifice was the same thing as love. Reverend Matthews had quietly made the phone call to Sunset Manor, and was speaking in low tones with someone who was clearly relieved to learn that Margaret Rose was safe and would be returned shortly. After ending the call, he approached us with the gentle expression of someone who had spent his career helping people navigate the intersection of faith, forgiveness, and human frailty. Margaret Rose, the staff at Sunset Manor, confirms that you've been missing since early this morning, and they're very grateful that Robert found you and that you're unharmed, he said kindly. They mentioned that you've been having some difficulties with memory and confusion lately, particularly when you become emotionally distressed about events from your past. They think that seeing something that reminded you of your wedding day might have triggered an episode that caused you to leave the facility without telling anyone where you were going. The clinical explanation for Margaret Rose's appearance on the highway in a vintage wedding dress made sense from a medical perspective, but it didn't diminish the miraculous nature of our reunion or the importance of finally being able to share truths that had been buried for more than half a century. Whether her confusion had been caused by dementia, trauma, medication side effects, or simply the overwhelming weight of carrying unanswered questions for 53 years, seemed less important than the fact that we had been given this unexpected opportunity to find healing, understanding, and perhaps even peace with the choices that had defined both our lives. "Robert," she said, squeezing my hands with surprising strength, "I need you to know that learning the truth about why you left doesn't erase all the pain of the past 53 years, but it does change everything about how I understand that pain, how I carry it, and what it means about who we were to each other and who we still might be if God is kind enough to give us a second chance at this stage of our lives." The drive to Sunset Manor Assisted Living took 47 minutes through afternoon traffic that gave us precious time to continue conversations that should have happened decades ago, to fill in the gaps between the teenagers we had been and the seniors we had become, to trace the paths our lives had taken after that devastating morning in 1971, when fear and misunderstanding had torn us apart, just hours before we were supposed to become husband and wife. Margaret Rose sat beside me in the front seat of the charter bus, her hand resting gently in mine, while my passengers provided the kind of respectful quiet that allowed us to speak privately, despite being surrounded by witnesses to this extraordinary reunion. "Tell me about your children," Margaret Rose said, her voice carrying genuine interest mixed with the bittersweet awareness that these should have been our children, grandchildren we should have raised together, family stories we should have created as a team rather than as separate individuals building separate lives with different people. I want to know about the family you built after you left St. Augustine, the life you created with Helen, the ways you found happiness despite everything we lost. I told her about Jennifer, my eldest daughter, who had become a pediatric surgeon in Atlanta and was raising twin boys with her husband Michael, a kind man who taught middle school mathematics and coached soccer on weekends. I described my son David, who had followed his artistic talents to New York, where he worked as a graphic designer for publishing companies while pursuing his real passion for oil painting in a studio apartment that was too small for his canvases, but perfect for his creative soul. Finally, I shared stories about my youngest daughter, Sarah, who had inherited her mother's nurturing spirit and worked as a registered nurse in the same hospital where Helen had volunteered for 15 years before cancer took her away 3 years ago. "They sound wonderful," Margaret Rose said with genuine warmth, though I could see in her eyes the shadow of loss for the family we might have raised together, the children who would have been ours, the shared experiences of parenthood that had been denied to us by circumstances beyond our control. Helen must have been an extraordinary woman to raise such accomplished, caring children. "I'm sorry for your loss, Robert. Losing a life partner after more than 4 decades together must have been devastating." The conversation turned to Margaret Rose's life, the choices she had made and the paths she had followed after our broken engagement changed her understanding of love, trust, and her own worth as someone deserving of genuine affection and commitment. She had earned a master's degree in library science from Florida State University, spent 38 years working as head librarian at Flagler College, and devoted countless volunteer hours to literacy programs, historical preservation societies, and organizations that provided educational opportunities for underprivileged children in Northeast Florida. I threw myself into my career in community service, partly because it felt meaningful, and partly because staying busy made it easier to avoid thinking too deeply about what I had lost when you disappeared, she explained, with the kind of honest self-reflection that comes with age and perspective. I told myself that I was fulfilled, that my life had purpose and value even without marriage and children, that I was proof that a woman could build a complete, satisfying life without needing a husband or family to define her worth and identity. But as she continued sharing her story, it became clear that beneath her professional accomplishments and community contributions, Margaret Rose had carried the same sense of incompleteness that had haunted me throughout my marriage to Helen. She had never stopped wondering what might have been, never completely healed from the wound of being abandoned without explanation, never fully trusted her judgment about love and relationships because the most important relationship of her youth had ended in betrayal and mystery. "I dated wonderful men who would have made excellent husbands," she continued, her voice growing softer as she revealed vulnerabilities that she had probably never shared with anyone else. There was Dr. William Harrison, a history professor at Flagler who courted me for 3 years with flowers, poetry, and patient understanding of my hesitancy about commitment. There was James Crawford, a widowed banker who shared my love of classical music and literature, who would have given me financial security and social status, and all the comfortable predictability my parents had always wanted for me. The pattern of her romantic life revealed how deeply our broken engagement had affected her ability to trust her own feelings, to believe that she was worthy of the kind of love that would fight for her, instead of walking away when obstacles appeared. Every relationship had been measured against what we had shared, found wanting in comparison to the intensity and certainty she remembered from our teenage romance, and eventually ended because she could never fully commit her heart to men who reminded her of what she had lost, rather than offering something new and different. As we approached the Sunset Manor facility, an elegant complex of buildings designed to look more like a resort than an institutional care facility, I felt the growing awareness that our time together was coming to an end, that this miraculous reunion would soon return to the realm of memory rather than present reality. The staff members who came out to meet our bus were clearly relieved to see Margaret Rose safe and unharmed, but their professional kindness also carried the implicit message that she needed to return to the structured environment where her increasing confusion could be managed safely. "Mr. Mitchell," said Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the facility's medical director, after I had helped Margaret Rose off the bus and we had explained the circumstances of how we had found each other on Interstate 95, "I want to thank you for taking such good care of Margaret Rose today. She's been having increasingly frequent episodes of disorientation and anxiety, particularly around anniversaries or events that trigger memories from her past. Today would have been her wedding anniversary if she had married as planned 53 years ago. The timing was not coincidental, and it added another layer of poignancy to our reunion, suggesting that Margaret Rose's subconscious mind had been drawn to recreate or resolve something connected to June 12, 1971, the day that had changed both our lives forever. Her appearance on the highway in a vintage wedding dress was not random confusion, but a profound psychological attempt to return to the moment when our story had been broken, to find the missing pieces that would help her understand why her life had taken the shape it had. "Dr. Hendricks," I said, making a decision that surprised me with its clarity and certainty, "I'd like your permission to visit Margaret Rose regularly, if she's comfortable with that arrangement. We've had conversations today that have been healing for both of us, and I think continued contact might be beneficial as she processes memories and experiences that have been troubling her for many years." Margaret Rose looked at me with an expression of hope mixed with fear, as if she wanted desperately to believe that this reunion could lead to ongoing connection, but was afraid to trust that someone who had disappeared from her life once might not disappear again. "Robert, you don't owe me anything. You have your own life, your own family responsibilities, your own routines that don't need to be disrupted by an elderly woman whose mind isn't as reliable as it used to be." "Margaret Rose," I said, taking her hands one final time before she would return to the care of medical professionals who could provide the structure and safety her condition required. "You're not a disruption or an obligation. You're the first love of my life, and finding you today has reminded me that some connections are too important to lose twice. If you're willing, I'd like to see where this second chance might lead us, what kind of relationship we might be able to build now that we finally understand what really happened 53 years ago." The weeks that followed our Highway 95 reunion became the most emotionally complex and surprisingly joyful period of my life since Helen's death 3 years earlier, as Margaret Rose and I carefully, cautiously began to rebuild a connection that had been severed by lies, misunderstandings, and the interference of people who thought they knew what was best for us better than we knew ourselves. I visited Sunset Manor 3 times a week, initially for brief afternoon conversations in the facility's beautifully landscaped gardens, gradually extending to longer visits that included shared meals, participation in activities, and the slow, delicate process of helping Margaret Rose distinguish between memories from different periods of her life, when her confusion made past and present blend together in ways that were sometimes distressing and sometimes surprisingly illuminating. Dr. Hendricks had explained that Margaret Rose's cognitive condition was complicated, involving elements of dementia mixed with depression, anxiety, and what appeared to be post-traumatic stress related to events from her youth that had never been properly processed or resolved. Our renewed relationship was actually beneficial for her mental health, providing structure, emotional security, and motivation to engage with reality in ways that no amount of medical intervention or therapeutic activity had been able to accomplish during her previous months at the facility. "She's more lucid during and after your visits than she's been since arriving here 8 months ago," Dr. Hendricks told me during one of our regular consultations about Margaret Rose's progress and needs. "Whatever healing is happening between the two of you is having a measurably positive impact on her cognitive function, her emotional stability, and her overall quality of life. I've never seen anything quite like it in 30 years of geriatric medicine. The healing was mutual, though my benefits were emotional rather than medical, as I discovered that sharing the truth about our past with Margaret Rose had lifted a burden I had carried for so long that I had forgotten how heavy it was, until suddenly it was gone. For the first time since Helen's death, I found myself looking forward to specific days and activities, making plans that extended beyond basic maintenance of my daily routines, caring about someone's well-being in ways that reminded me what it felt like to be needed and appreciated, not just for practical assistance, but for emotional companionship. Margaret Rose had good days and difficult days, moments of perfect clarity when she seemed exactly like the sharp, witty, intellectually curious woman I had fallen in love with in high school, alternating with periods of confusion when she forgot where she was, what year it was, or why she was spending time with a bus driver named Robert, who claimed to have known her decades earlier. But even during her confused episodes, she responded to my presence with warmth and trust. as if some deeper part of her consciousness recognized our connection, even when her conscious mind couldn't access the specific memories that explained our relationship. The most meaningful breakthrough came 6 weeks after our highway reunion, during a visit when Margaret Rose seemed particularly clear and focused, more present than I had seen her since that day on Interstate 95. We were sitting in the facility's chapel, a non-denominational space designed to provide comfort and reflection for residents from various religious backgrounds, when she suddenly turned to me with tears in her eyes and an expression of profound regret. "Robert," she said, her voice carrying the weight of 53 years of accumulated sorrow and misunderstanding, "I need to apologize for something I've never told you, something that might change how you feel about our whole story and whether you want to continue spending time with a foolish old woman who made terrible decisions based on pride and hurt feelings." I prepared myself for another revelation that would add complexity to our already complicated history, another piece of the puzzle that would help explain how two people who loved each other so deeply could have spent more than 5 decades apart because of misunderstandings and outside interference that had torn apart what should have been an unbreakable bond. After you left town, after I spent months trying to understand what had happened and why you had abandoned me without any explanation, I hired a private investigator to find you, she continued, her hands trembling as she forced herself to reveal a secret she had apparently kept for more than 50 years. "I found out where you were living, discovered that you had married Helen, learned that you seemed to be building a happy life with someone else, while I was still trying to put my broken heart back together." The implications of what she was telling me began to settle in, as I realized that Margaret Rose had known where I was and had chosen not to contact me, just as I had eventually learned her whereabouts years later and chosen not to disrupt what appeared to be her successful, fulfilling life as a respected librarian and community leader who had built her identity around independence and professional achievement rather than marriage and family. I could have contacted you, Robert. I could have demanded explanations, insisted on understanding what had really happened between us, fought for the truth instead of accepting the lies my father had told me about your character and motivations. But I was proud, and I was hurt, and I convinced myself that if you had really loved me the way I loved you, nothing could have kept you from the church that day, or prevented you from finding a way to explain your absence. The tragedy of our situation became even more complete, as I understood that we had both had opportunities to reconnect, to seek truth instead of accepting painful assumptions, to fight for our relationship instead of protecting ourselves from additional heartbreak by maintaining distance and silence. We had both chosen safety over courage, protection over vulnerability, the certainty of loss over the possibility of reconciliation that might have led to even greater disappointment. "Margaret Rose," I said gently, taking her hands in mine with the same tenderness I had felt during our first reunion on the highway. We were both young, both scared, both dealing with grief and confusion that we didn't have the experience or wisdom to handle differently. Apologizing for decisions you made 50 years ago when you were trying to survive heartbreak with whatever resources you had available seems less important than focusing on what we can do with the time we have now. The conversation marked a turning point in our renewed relationship, as we both acknowledged that we were not the same people we had been in 1971, that we had lived full, meaningful lives, despite the loss of what we might have shared together, that our connection now was based on who we had become rather than who we had been when we first fell in love. We were not trying to recapture our youth or pretend that 53 years of separate experiences hadn't changed us fundamentally. Instead, we were exploring whether two people in their 70s who had never stopped caring about each other might be able to create something new and valuable despite the limitations imposed by time, health, and circumstances. Margaret Rose's condition continued to fluctuate, but our relationship provided stability and purpose that benefited both of us in ways that surprised everyone, including my 3 children who had initially been concerned about my emotional investment in someone whose cognitive decline might lead to increased heartbreak for both of us. Jennifer, David, and Sarah gradually came to understand that their father had found a source of joy and meaning that was helping him process his grief over losing their mother while also resolving issues from his past that had affected his entire adult life in subtle but significant ways. As I reflect on these past months with Margaret Rose, I realize that our story is not the traditional romance that most people expect when they hear about childhood sweethearts reuniting after decades apart. We are not going to ride off into the sunset together, planning adventures and building the future we were denied in our youth. Margaret Rose's condition means that our time together is precious precisely because it is limited, unpredictable, and dependent on medical realities that we cannot control or change through the strength of our feelings for each other. But what we have found together is something perhaps more valuable than traditional romance. The peace that comes from understanding, the healing that results from truth, the profound comfort of knowing that the most important love of your life was real, lasting, and worthy of the grief you carried when you thought it was lost forever. If you've stayed with me through this entire journey, through the highway reunion, and the gradual rediscovery of a love that survived 53 years of separation, it tells me something beautiful about who you are. You understand that the most meaningful stories don't always end with wedding bells and promises of forever. Sometimes they end with two elderly people holding hands in a care facility chapel, finally at peace with the past, and grateful for whatever time they have been given to love each other, with the wisdom that comes from a lifetime of learning what really matters. This channel exists for people like you, people who believe that love stories come in all shapes and sizes, that healing can happen at any age, that it's never too late to find understanding, forgiveness, and connection with the people who have shaped our hearts. Please subscribe not because you want entertainment, but because you want to be part of a community that celebrates the full spectrum of human experience, that honors the complexity of real relationships, that believes every person deserves to have their story witnessed and valued. Share your own stories in the comments below. Tell us about the person you never forgot, the relationship that changed you, the moment when understanding replaced years of confusion or hurt. Let us know what topics you'd like to explore together, what kinds of stories touch your heart, and remind you of the experiences that have made you who you are. This is more than just a YouTube channel. It's a place where people who understand the profound power of human connection can find each other and remember that we are all part of the same beautiful, complicated, heartbreaking, hope-filled human family.